Did you know that Africa's borders, the lines that separate one country from another, weren't drawn in Africa at all? In fact, those borders didn't even exist in the 1800s. Back then, if you had asked somebody where they was from, they wouldn't say Ghana or Senegal or Ivory Coast like they do today. They would have told you their kingdom, their empire, or their ethnic group. So why is Africa divided into 54 countries today? Why are the Soninké spread across Mali, Mauritania, and Gambia? That's the question we're going to answer in today's episode. Welcome back to another episode of Daylight About Africa. I'm your host, Nuba, and if nobody told you the real story, I will. So in today's episode, we'll be breaking down the infamous Berlin Conference in 1884. Y'all probably learned about it in elementary school or maybe even high school a little bit, but it was essentially the meeting in Europe where Africa was carved up like a cake and borders were drawn with rulers without a single African in the room. So let's get into it. But before we even get into Berlin, I want to set the stage. Like, what was actually going on in the world in the late 1800s? This was peak Industrial Revolution. Basically, Europe had just leveled up its tech, like factories, trains, machines, and suddenly they needed way more raw materials. We're talking cotton for their textiles, rubbers for new inventions like tires, coal, palm oil, ivory, and of course, gold. Europe was eating up resources like it was Black Friday, and Africa had everything they wanted. But it wasn't just about resources, it was also about competition. France and Britain were racing each other to grab as much land as possible. Belgium wanted to make a name for itself, and Germany had just unified in 1871, so they were trying to prove they belonged in the big leagues too. Europe was basically one big competition for clout, power, and land. Meanwhile, and this is super important, Africa was not some empty land waiting to be discovered. The way the European maps tried to make it look, it was full of powerful kingdoms and empires. The Ashanti in what's now Ghana, with armies and gold that Europeans literally feared. The Zulu in southern Africa, who had already clashed with the British and showed they weren't easy to defeat. The Sokoto Caliphate in Nigeria, which was a massive Islamic state with trade networks reaching across the Sahara. And of course, groups like the Soninké, Wolof, and Mandinka who had their own political systems, traditions, and borders long before anyone in Europe cared. But to Europe, none of that even mattered. They didn't see Africa as a continent full of people with systems and civilizations. They saw it as a giant store, raw materials on the shelves, free for the taking. And the only problem, they were all rushing in at the same time, and it was about to get messy, like messy group project energy. Okay, that's why Germany's leader Otto von Bismarck calls a meeting in his capital in 1884. 14 European powers showed up, but not a single African gets an invite. And together, tell me why they literally had the audacity to sit down to literally divide Africa like it's a pizza. So by the time Berlin was called in 1884, Europeans were already on the ground in Africa. Britain had forts along the Gold Coast. France was pushing inland from Senegal. Belgium's King Leopold had claimed the Congo as its personal playground of violence. Portugal had been holding on to Angola and Mozambique for centuries, and in short, the scramble for Africa was already happening, but it was messy. European powers were tripping over each other, making competing claims, and the tension in Europe was just heating up. If they did not sit down and make rules, this land grab could turn into a European war. So Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck calls a meeting. Picture it, Berlin, winter of 1884, inside a grand hall, representatives from 14 countries sit around a giant map of Africa, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, Spain, Italy, and even the United States as an observer. But like I said, who's not in the room? Any African, not a king, not a leader, not even a single representative. The future of Africa was being decided without Africans. So to Europe, that map looked like opportunity. To Africa, it would become a disaster. These men were not asking, what do Africans want? They were asking, how do we divide this land so we don't fight each other? And that's the craziest part. The Berlin Conference wasn't about Africa at all. It was about Europe keeping the peace with itself. And so they made rules. The biggest one was called the principle of effective occupation. Basically, you couldn't just claim land by planting a flag anymore. You had to prove you actually controlled it with soldiers, forts, or administrators on the ground. And if you didn't, another European power could literally snatch it up. Think of it like calling dibs on a slice of pizza, but no one believes you unless you already taken a bite. Other rules said the Congo and Niger rivers had to stay open for trade, missionaries, and traders to have access, and on paper, slavery was to be suppressed. But reality, the main goal was carving up land, drawing straight lines with rulers, cutting through kingdoms, ignoring cultures and communities, because for them, Africa wasn't a home, it was a prize. So, what did all those lines in Berlin actually mean for Africans? So, overnight, whole communities were split across borders they never agreed to. Families, kingdoms, ethnic groups divided by European rulers with pens. Take Gambia. If you ever looked at a map, you will see this tiny strip of land cut in straight into Senegal like a knife. Why? Because Britain wanted to control the Gambia River, a major trade route. France wanted the land around it. So instead of figuring out what made sense for the people living there, they just carved out Gambia out of Senegal and called it a country. Now, today, Gambians and Senegalese share language, religion, culture, but are technically in two different nations. Or look at Somalia. Somalis aren't just in Somalia, they're also in Ethiopia, Kenya, and in Djibouti. For centuries, one people. That border wasn't made by Somalis. It was Europeans drawing straight lines across the Horn of Africa, cutting through communities that had been connected for centuries. And it's not just a fun fact, those divisions have fueled conflict, displacement, and instability for decades. Same with the Ewe people, split between Ghana and Togo, or the Soninké, spread across Mali, Senegal, Mauritania, and Gambia, like I mentioned earlier. Imagine meeting somebody who speaks your language, practices your traditions, and shares your history, but when you ask them, where are you from? They name a whole different country. That's not migration, that's colonial borders. And the craziest part out of all of this is that these borders still exist today, right? We know them as Africa's 54 countries, but most of these borders are straight out of the conference. They weren't even made to reflect the people, the culture, or the history. They were made to reflect European convenience. And here's the thing about these borders, they weren't just lines on a map, they became walls between people, barriers to unity, and the source of conflicts that still shape Africa today, like I mentioned. Politically, these borders created weak and divided states. Countries were stitched together out of dozens of different ethnic groups who didn't necessarily share the same history or system of governance. That's why so many African nations have struggled with political instability, not because Africans cannot govern them themselves, but because the playing field was rigged from the start. Imagine trying to build a house where the foundation was already cracked. That's what independence leaders were handed. Socially, families and communities were split. Somalis across 4 countries, the Ewe between Ghana and Togo, the Soninké across West Africa. People who should have been part of the same nation suddenly needed passports to visit cousins just across the border. These artificial separations created tension and sometimes even war because Europe had ignored how Africans actually lived. And economically, the borders forced African countries into shapes that served Europe's interests, not Africa's. Nations were designed around resource extraction. Rubber here, cotton over there, gold over there. Railroads also didn't connect Africans to each other. They connected mines to ports so goods can be shipped back to Europe. And that's a setup many economies are still trying to break free from today. And after independence in the 20th century, African leaders chose to keep those colonial borders, but not because they didn't like them, but because redrawing the entire map could have led to even more chaos and violence. So instead, they stuck with what Berlin had left behind, which means in 2025, Africa is still living inside a map drawn in 1884 by people who never lived there, never cared, and never asked. So you might be thinking, okay, that was over like what, 140 years ago? Why does it still matter today? Here's why. Because the Berlin Conference didn't just create borders, it created identities, conflicts, and systems that we still live inside. Every time you see Africans with the same culture separated into different countries, that's Berlin. Every time African nations struggled with borders that don't match the people inside them, that's Berlin. And every time Africa is boxed in as 54 separate countries instead of one connected continent, that's Berlin too. But here's the part I really want you to sit with. These borders were never natural. They were never inevitable. They were designed. And if they were designed, they can also be reimagined. Not necessarily by redrawing lines on a map, but by the way we think, the way we connect, and the way we build across them. The younger generation, us, we don't have to keep inheriting Berlin's worldview. We can create our own. So why does this matter in 2025? Because the Berlin Conference didn't just shape Africa's borders, it shaped how the world sees Africans and how we sometimes see ourselves. And here's the truth. Those borders were never natural. They were made. And if they were made, we can refuse to let them define us. And for us, Gen Z, the diaspora, young Africans, this history is not just something to memorize. It's something to act on. It means choosing to connect across borders instead of being boxed in by them. It means supporting African businesses and creators no matter what country they're in. It means learning our languages, our histories, and our cultures that existed long before 1884. It means telling our stories on TikTok, on YouTube, in classrooms and conversations instead of letting Europe's story be the only one that is heard. And most of all, it means not buying into the lie that Africa is weak or divided by nature. Because we're not. We're divided by design. And when you realize something was designed, you also realize it can be redesigned by us, by the way we move, by the way we think, the way we build together. So when you hear somebody say Africa is poor or Africa is unstable, remember that's Berlin talking. That's not Africa. Africa is rich in culture, languages, people, and possibility. And it's on us, this generation, to connect across those lines, to rebuild what was broken, and to imagine something bigger than Berlin ever could. So let's bring it back. Africa's borders weren't drawn in Africa. They were drawn in Berlin with rulers, pens, and zero Africans in the room. That single meeting in 1884 still shapes the continent we know today. 54 countries divided by lines that were never ours to begin with. But here's the part I hope you carry with you. Those borders do not define who we are. They never did. We are bigger than Berlin's map, okay? And if nobody told you this story before, now you know. Now you can see past the lie. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it, okay? You can choose to reconnect across those borders. You can support Africa as a whole, not just one piece of it. You can reclaim languages, cultures, and histories that existed long before 1884. And most importantly, you can tell the story to someone else. Because the more of us who know, the harder it is for the lie to survive. So thank you again for tuning into another episode of Daylight About Africa. I hope you enjoyed this one. And if you did, make sure to check out our other episodes. We've covered everything from the real size of Africa to brain drain to climate change to mental health in African communities and even how to invest in places like Ghana or Senegal. There is so much more of our story to uncover. If you want to go even deeper, I linked all the sources I used to put this episode together in my link tree. You'll find that right in my bio. And don't forget to follow us on social media and stay plugged in. We're on Instagram at They Lied About Africa and on TikTok at They Lied About Africa as well, where I drop early notices about new episodes and other content that breaks down Africa beyond the headlines. Until next week, I'm your host, Numbe. And if nobody told you the real story, I will.